Summary. I never expected that a simple weekend visit from my cousin's son would stay with me for years. What happened wasn't dramatic or scandalous, but it changed the way I saw myself, my past, and the people I thought I already understood. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. I still remember the quiet hum of the house that Friday afternoon, the kind of steady stillness you only appreciate when the kids are grown and the days stretch a little longer than they used to. I had just finished wiping down the kitchen counter when I heard a car door close outside. The sound echoed lightly through the neighborhood, and for a moment I felt a mix of curiosity and nostalgia rise in my chest. My cousin's son, Mark, had called a week earlier asking if he could stop by on his way through town. I hadn't seen him in years. The last time, he had been a lanky college kid who struggled to make eye contact and spoke as if every word had to be pulled out of him. Now, I wasn't sure what to expect. When I stepped out onto the porch, he was already walking up the path with an easy smile. He looked older, of course, but also more grounded, like someone who had learned to breathe a little deeper. His shoulders had filled out, and there was a warmth behind his eyes I didn't remember from before. "Aunt Lisa," he said, and his voice carried a sincerity that made me smile before I even realized it. "It's really good to see you." It was simple, but something about the way he said it softened me. Maybe it was the sincerity, or maybe it was just comforting to feel remembered. We went inside, and he placed his bag neatly by the door. He glanced around the living room, taking in the framed photos, the worn but loved furniture, and the soft afternoon light streaming through the curtains. "It smells the same," he said, almost to himself, "like lemon polish and coffee." I laughed and told him some things never change, especially habits I learned from my mother. He nodded as though he understood that completely, and we fell into easy conversation. The sun was just beginning to lower, filling the house with that warm golden glow that makes everything look softer. Mark sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a glass of iced tea. He talked about his work, the long hours, the travel, and the moments of doubt that came with trying to build the kind of life he wasn't sure he wanted anymore. I listened, really listened, and somewhere in the middle of his story, I realized how rare it felt to have someone speak so openly with me. He wasn't rushed, wasn't posturing, wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply present, and that presence filled the room with a quiet energy I couldn't quite name. There was a moment when he paused and looked out the window, his expression thoughtful. He said he sometimes missed the simplicity of childhood, the days spent at family gatherings when he didn't yet understand how complicated adult life could become. I felt a tug in my chest because I understood that too well. When he looked back at me, his eyes held a kind of gentle earnestness, as though he trusted me with thoughts he didn't share often. And I was surprised by how much it meant to be seen that way, not just as the older relative who hosted holiday dinners, but as someone whose presence mattered. As the evening settled in, we made a simple dinner together, moving around the kitchen in a comfortable rhythm that felt strangely familiar for two people who hadn't shared a room in years. The conversation flowed easily, sometimes light, sometimes quietly reflective. I hadn't expected his visit to feel so grounding. I certainly hadn't expected the subtle ripple it created inside me. Something warm, something attentive, something that reminded me I was still capable of connection in ways I hadn't experienced in a long time. By the time we sat down to eat, I realized I was genuinely glad he had come. Something about the way he carried himself, the calm steadiness of his voice, brought a sense of peace into the house I hadn't known I was missing. What I didn't know then was that this visit, brief as it was meant to be, would open a door to memories, choices, and emotions I hadn't explored in years, something that would stay with me far longer than a weekend. That night, after dinner, the house settled into the gentle quiet that usually came at the end of my days, but it felt different with another person breathing under the same roof. I could hear Mark moving around in the guest room, unzipping his suitcase, placing things carefully on the small dresser I kept there. It brought back memories of when my children were younger, those familiar sounds of someone settling in, turning a house into a shared space. I was sitting at the dining table, sorting through the last of the dishes, when he walked in again. He had changed into a simple t-shirt, comfortable and relaxed, and he carried the calmness of someone who had finally exhaled after a long stretch of strain. He asked if I wanted to sit outside for a little while, just to get some fresh air before calling it a night. I found myself saying yes before I even thought about it. We stepped out onto the back porch, the boards creaking under our feet the way they always did. The sky had darkened, but a soft breeze carried the scent of the neighbor's jasmine, and the porch light cast a warm glow over the small space. It was quiet except for the distant hum of cars on the main road and the occasional chirp of crickets. Mark leaned against the railing, arms crossed loosely, looking out into the yard. He told me he had always liked this porch, even as a kid. Said it felt safe in a way he couldn't quite explain. That surprised me. I'd never thought much about the porch beyond its practicality, but hearing him describe it like that made me see it differently, almost as if his words illuminated something I had overlooked. I asked him what had brought him through town, really. He hesitated for a moment before answering. Not in a secretive way, more like he was searching for the right words. He said he'd taken some time off work unexpectedly, that he needed a break, even if he hadn't admitted it to himself at first. He'd been driving without much of a plan, just stopping where it felt right. I understood that feeling all too well, those stretches of life when the road ahead feels uncertain, and you start questioning choices you made years ago. I told him that. I didn't go into detail, but he nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. There was a stillness between us, not awkward, but thoughtful. Sometimes silence can feel like a shared acknowledgement, a moment where both people are quietly admitting things without saying them aloud. That's how it felt then. After a while, he asked me about my own life, how things had been since the kids moved out, how I spent my days now. It struck me how genuinely he listened, giving me his full attention in a way that felt rare. I told him about the things that filled my time, the routines that comforted me, the small joys, and the quiet spots of loneliness that crept in when I wasn't expecting them. He didn't try to fix anything or give advice. He simply listened, and that alone eased something inside me. Eventually, he sat down on the porch steps, stretching his legs out, and I joined him. We watched the porch light draw tiny moths in gentle patterns, and the conversation drifted into memories, family gatherings from years back, stories we each remembered differently, the people we missed, the people who had drifted away. There was a moment when he laughed at something I said, a full and warm laugh that seemed to brighten the night for a second, and I realized how long it had been since I'd had company that brought that kind of ease to my heart. Not excitement, not drama, just ease. The kind that makes you breathe more slowly, more deliberately. As the night grew cooler, I felt a sense of closeness, not in the sense of anything romantic or inappropriate, but in the way two people can find understanding across years, across generational differences, across experiences that somehow mirror each other more than either expected. Eventually, we stood and headed inside, the porch creaking again under our steps. He told me thanks for listening, his voice soft but sincere. I told him he was always welcome, and I meant it. When I turned off the lights and headed to my own room, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long while, a gentle anticipation for the next day, the kind that comes when you realize someone's presence has brought a new perspective into your life. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or how long he planned to stay, but as I settled into bed, I felt certain of one thing. This visit was already teaching me something about myself, something I had forgotten, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face, but needed to. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Something about having another person in the house sharpened my senses, as if I were tuning back into a version of myself I hadn't needed in years. The sun had only just begun to slip through the curtains, casting a pale glow over the room. I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps in the hallway, and for a moment I felt the familiar comfort of not being alone. When I stepped into the kitchen, Mark was already there, standing by the window with a mug of coffee in his hands. He looked peaceful, almost contemplative, watching the morning light stretch across the yard. It reminded me of how quiet moments could hold more meaning than long conversations. "Morning," he said with an easy smile. "I didn't want to wake you, so I made the coffee." I thanked him, and we settled into a gentle rhythm, me reaching for plates, him grabbing utensils, the two of us moving around each other like old friends rather than distant relatives. I realized how rare it was to share a morning like this with someone. Most of my days started in silence, with only the slow hum of the coffee maker for company. We sat down to a simple breakfast, eggs, toast, nothing fancy, and talked about small things at first. The weather, the neighborhood, the quiet little bakery that had opened recently down the street. But slowly, the conversation deepened. He spoke about feeling unanchored lately, unsure of what direction his life was supposed to be moving in. He said it wasn't that anything was wrong, exactly, just that something felt missing, and he didn't know how to name it yet. I understood that feeling too well, and he could tell by the way I sighed. I told him that reaching my age had brought its own sort of uncertainty, that once the children grew up and the house grew quieter, I had struggled to figure out who I was without all the roles I'd carried for years. I hadn't expected to admit that aloud, much less to him, but something about his presence made honesty feel natural. He nodded slowly, his gaze softening. "I didn't know you ever felt like that," he said. I told him most people don't talk about those things. We carry them quietly, tucked beneath the routines and responsibilities. And sometimes all it takes is someone willing to listen for it to finally come out. After breakfast, we stepped outside for a walk around the neighborhood. The air was crisp, the kind that hinted at the changing seasons. Leaves rustled gently, and a few early joggers passed us with brief nods. Mark walked beside me with his hands in his pockets, and the conversation drifted in and out like waves. He asked about the choices I'd made in my life, why I stayed in this town, how I balanced raising a family with everything else I wanted. I hadn't realized how rarely anyone asked me questions like that anymore. It felt strangely refreshing, almost renewing, to revisit the path that had led me here. At one point, we passed an old oak tree that had stood in the neighborhood for longer than I'd been alive. Its branches stretched wide, offering shade and stillness. Mark paused and looked up at it with quiet admiration. "Things that last," he murmured. "I respect that." I turned to him and said that lasting doesn't always mean staying the same. Sometimes you grow in ways people don't see. Sometimes you bend, sometimes you shed things you no longer need, but you're still rooted, still standing. He looked at me then, not with surprise but with a thoughtful appreciation. I don't think he expected me to say something that mirrored his own search for meaning so closely. As we continued walking, a gentle awareness settled between us, the kind that comes when two people recognize something familiar in each other's journey. There was no fanfare, no dramatic revelation, just a steady connection built on shared truths. When we returned to the house, the late morning sun had warmed the porch steps, and we sat down for a moment before going inside. Mark thanked me, not for the breakfast or the walk, but for the conversation, for listening, for being open. I felt a quiet shift inside me, not dramatic, just real. His visit was no longer simply a stop on his way through town. It had become something deeper, something unexpectedly meaningful for both of us. And although I didn't yet know where the rest of the day would take us, I sensed that something important was unfolding, something that would continue to guide me long after he returned to his own life. The afternoon passed more gently than I expected. After our walk, Mark asked if he could help with anything around the house, and I pointed him toward a loose porch rail I had been meaning to tighten for weeks. He grabbed the toolbox from the garage without hesitation, and for the next hour I listened to the steady rhythm of his work while I tended to some gardening nearby. There was something grounding about the simple tasks, two people quietly tending to the same space, each in our own way. Every so often we'd exchange a small comment, a question about the tools, a memory about a plant, an observation about the weather. Nothing heavy, nothing dramatic, but each moment layered gently onto the next, creating a sense of shared purpose I hadn't realized I'd missed. When he finished, he stepped back and wiped his hands on a rag. The rail looked sturdy again, straight and strong. I told him it was good work, and he smiled with a modesty that reminded me of the boy he used to be. Then he surprised me by saying that doing something physical, something useful, made him feel a little steadier than he had in months. Sometimes, he said, when life gets too complicated, it feels good to fix something simple. I understood that completely. We all need small accomplishments to balance the larger uncertainties. Later, we sat inside with glasses of cold lemonade. The sunlight filtered through the living room curtains, casting soft patterns across the floor. It was the kind of quiet afternoon that encourages reflection without forcing it. Mark leaned back in the armchair, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him since he arrived. "There's something else I should tell you," he said after a pause. Not a confession, but more like a truth he finally decided to share. He explained that the reason he started this trip wasn't just a desire for time off. A close friend of his had recently gone through a difficult period, and it had shaken him. It made him question how he was living, what he valued, and why he kept postponing the changes he knew he needed. I didn't know what to say at first, but then I realized he didn't need me to fix anything. He just needed someone to hear him. So I listened, really listened, the way he had listened to me the night before. He said he hadn't expected to feel comfortable opening up. Not with anyone, especially not with me. But being here reminded him of a sense of steadiness he couldn't find anywhere else lately. I felt emotion rise in me, not sadness, not joy, something gentler. Something like gratitude. It's rare to be told that your presence, your ordinary way of being, had given someone comfort without you even trying. We talked for a long time after that, quietly and honestly, about choices we wished we'd made differently, about the ways life redirects us when we least expect it, about the people who shape us, sometimes without ever knowing they did. When the sun finally dipped toward the horizon, Mark said he needed to get back on the road the next morning. His voice wasn't heavy, just certain, the kind of certainty that comes when you've taken a moment to breathe, to reflect, and to gather whatever strength you'd misplaced. That evening we shared one last meal, nothing elaborate. Just warm food, warm conversation, and a sense of calm that wrapped itself around the room. Before turning in for the night, he thanked me again, not just for the hospitality, but for something deeper, something he hadn't yet found the words for. The next morning, I stood on the porch as he loaded his bag into the car. The sky was clear, the air cool. He gave me a long, sincere look, one that held appreciation and respect, and maybe a hint of the clarity he'd been searching for. "Take care of yourself, Aunt Lisa," he said, "and thank you. Truly." I told him he was welcome any time, and I meant it in the deepest way possible. Not because I needed company, but because what we shared during his brief visit had reminded me of something I had forgotten. Connection doesn't depend on age or expectations or perfect timing. It only needs openness, honesty, and two people willing to meet each other exactly where they are. I watched his car disappear down the street, and when I stepped back inside the quiet house, it felt different, not emptier, but fuller somehow. As though his presence had rearranged something inside me, reminding me that growth doesn't stop, not at 40, not at 60, not ever. His visit may have been short, but its impact settled deep, becoming one of those memories that lingers, soft but unshakable, a reminder that life still holds unexpected moments of meaning if we're willing to let them in. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give us like and subscribe.